Hi, everybody. We're going to get started now that we have people who've logged in. So today's webinar is about the Solar Thermal Challenge, and we've completed a municipal procurement pilot as part of this program. So a little bit about who we are, if you don't know already. So I'm Nicole Sanchez. I'm a Clean Energy Coordinator at MEPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And so we work with 101 cities and towns in the greater Boston region. And our clean energy team specifically works on different energy efficiency measures and mitigation measures with these communities. And our new project is 0 to 101, which is a net zero planning resource for our cities and towns. And so solar thermal fits under this planning process because it's a good measure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see more about what we do on our website. So today we're going to go over what this pilot looked like for municipal procurement for solar thermal systems, some lessons that we've learned now that we're at the end of this process, some resources that we're planning on putting together for cities and towns that want to procure solar thermal, and then we'll end with some questions and answers. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, just type your questions in at the bottom, and then we'll answer them when we get to that section. So the municipal procurement pilot is part of a larger program that MassDOT has been working on for solar thermal. So there's a pretty small market, but there are some really good incentives for solar thermal at the moment. So there were a couple of different pilots in different sectors of the market to see what's available right now, what that market looks like, and if we could find ways to expand the market or make some of the processes within that more efficient. So we worked with our cities and towns to see who was interested in participating in this initial procurement pilot. We did some market research initially on different vendors that were already in this space and what solar thermal systems would look like on municipal buildings. There weren't a lot of these systems installed in the municipal space already. Then we did outreach to our communities to see who would be interested in participating and who had some buildings that seemed like good fits. Then we worked on 2 different procurements that Patrick will speak about in a second, one for feasibility studies and one for the contracting for installation. And then we're going to be providing some ongoing technical assistance and support.
Great, thanks, Nicole. So this is Patrick Roach, Clean Energy Division. So for the municipal solar projects that we did, the solar thermal projects that we did, they're treated like a public building construction project. So what that means is that there's 2 phases to the project. You have a design phase and a construction phase. And there are procurement rules that apply to both of those. So the design phase is really where the feasibility study gets done. And we'll hear more about the details of the feasibility study. But it is sort of procured under this Chapter 7, and feasibility studies tend to cost around $5,000. So that puts you below the $10,000 sort of threshold, which is nice because that allows you to have a lot of flexibility in how you solicit the quotes. And MAPC, we chose to solicit quotes where vendors gave us background on their experience and qualifications as well as a price to do the work. So that's a relatively light lift, and it's very similar to, for those of you who are familiar with procuring supplies or services under $10,000, where you can use sound business practices if needed. So one interesting thing is, as Nicole will talk about later, the market for the solar thermal installers is relatively small right now, and so it's highly likely that the firm that does your feasibility study will want to bid on the installation or the construction portion. And so there are some things you do just want to be clear about up front when you are requesting the quotes for the feasibility study. You want to make sure they understand that they can bid on the install, and then when you do move to the installation bid, you want to take a couple precautions to make sure that you haven't given that person who did the feasibility study an unfair advantage. And those are simple things like making sure that you leave the installation bid open long enough that everyone has a really good reasonable amount of time to understand the material and prepare responses, and make sure that there's nothing proprietary in the specs that the feasibility study designer has put together. So the feasibility study really will be also providing essentially the foundation of the design that you'll be putting out to bid in the construction phase. And that is under the Chapter 149 for public building construction. In our case, we were putting out to bid both Winthrop and Chelsea at the same time, and their combined value of the installation was somewhere around $120,000. So that put us right in, there's sort of a couple different thresholds for what type of standards you need to follow based on how expensive the installation will be. And that category ranges from $50,000 to $150,000. And it's highly likely that your project on a municipal building would fall in that range. The project for Chelsea was around like 48, just about 50,000, and Winthrop was 84. So you get a sense that you'll probably be in that range. And there are some requirements that you need to do in terms of how you advertise it, how bidders submit, but essentially it's a type of bid, an invitation for bids that is awarded to the lowest responsible and responsive bidder. So there's not an extensive evaluation process. And we'll talk through later on in this some best practices for how you put together the requirements of that document, but you should really have what you need for that document coming out of the feasibility study, and should also make putting this out to bid a relatively light lift. And I think one thing that is important to note is that during the procurement process for the installation, there's definitely going to need to be a site walkthrough that you offer the vendors, so just make sure you schedule enough time for them to get familiar on site with and take measurements of their own if they'd like to.
Okay. So that's those are the procurement vehicles that we used for this process. We have some of the results that we looked at after the feasibility study procurement, and so this is what the ice skating rink at Winthrop looked like. So you can see that there is a really good savings in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and there's also a financial payback for the system. It's a little bit longer than we were hoping for at the beginning of the process, but it's still definitely doable in both of these projects. And here at an ice rink, it was a little bit surprising to see this project be something that worked, because you don't usually think of renewable thermal and ice at the same time. But it did work out here, and we're moving forward with this project to the installation procurement. And then for the police station, we also, this is also a building with a lot of hot water use, and the important thing is that it also, both of these buildings had use throughout the year to be eligible for the Mass DC rebate. So this has a little bit longer of a payback than the other building that we're looking at. Both of these buildings are right now on natural gas, and that affects the payback time. So if you do have a building that's using heating oil, we're seeing a much faster paybacks on those. But in terms of a measure as part of your net zero planning or reaching your net zero target, this is a really good way to get a lot of bang for your buck in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So now I'm going to go through what the design process looks like and the different lessons that we've learned along the way that you can take into this process if you're looking to install solar thermal on a municipal building. So it really breaks down into 3 parts. So this initial vetting that is the prep work that you would want to do as a municipality before you go into either of these procurements, the feasibility study procurement, and then the installation procurement. So in this initial vetting process, you really want to be looking at the whole campus of buildings that you have available to you, seeing which you think would be good fits for solar thermal, trying to get a good idea of what the usage looks like for those buildings, making sure that there's year-round use, and then identifying space for the equipment that you know would be installed if you were to do solar thermal there, and to meet with facility managers and your local code officials to just double check that those spaces make sense. So siting for solar thermal is very similar to siting for solar PV. You want to look at the condition of the roof and the age of the roof. You're still looking to see, is it facing south? Does it get sunlight? A big difference between the two, though, is the amount of space that you're going to actually need for the collectors versus the space that you need for PV panels. With the Winthrop Ice Rink, we saw that we were able to actually put the number of solar thermal collectors that we needed on that roof, but previously Winthrop had looked into installing PV for that roof, and the amount of, just the number of PV panels that were needed for that roof pushed that roof over the edge of what it could hold structurally. So even if you've looked at a roof for PV and it's kind of been on the line of whether it's feasible or not, it's still worth looking into in this initial vetting process for solar thermal. And then on how to choose which buildings you really want to focus on, you want to look for 12 months of your water use, either through MEI or looking at the original utility bills. Identify some of the highest users in your portfolio. Those are buildings you want to focus on, and you also want to focus on buildings that have good siting. So ideally, you're mixing these 2 factors together. And then the other thing you want to pay attention to is what the current heating fuel is, whether you're using natural gas or oil. That's going to make a difference in your payback. So focusing on the more expensive buildings to heat as well. Some good candidates that we had found were buildings with gyms, pools. The ice skating rink used a lot of water for Zambonis and the showers. School buildings, police and fire stations because of the amount of use that's happening. And then a lesson that we learned from this process is to really think about, before you get started, how much storage space you have in the buildings and what this is going to look like at the end. So we found this good rule of thumb to estimate how much storage space you're going to need for the water storage tanks. So it's about 1 gallon of storage space for every 1 square foot of collector area. This isn't the total area where the collectors are. This is the area of the individual collector that's actually being used. So this would be on the spec sheets for different collectors. And you're thinking about this pretty early in the process just to get started, and so to get a good idea of what system size we're talking about, 8 collectors is a smaller commercial system. So the systems that we're looking at here were about 10 collectors. So that can give you an idea of how you don't really need that many collectors for any given building, but you do want to think about what a larger amount than you might need, and then estimate that storage that you want to set aside. And then the other reason to think about where you want the water storage tank and other accessory equipment to go is because you probably have some things in that space already. I know that storage space is really tight in all of our buildings. Something else to think about is where there might be roots existing in the building already that you could put plumbing for the system. In the case of the Chelsea Police Station, we needed to use an interior run for the plumbing that was coming from the collectors, from the storage tank to the collectors, because we had to get creative with where we're planning to put the hot water storage. It's helpful to have an interior run if you can, but you can usually do an exterior run as well. And the picture all the way on the right shows this relatively new vent that we identified as a place where we could put this interior plumbing run. So this is something to bring up during this meeting with your facilities managers. Think about some spaces that might run in the interior of the building. It'll be a more energy efficient way to get that heated water down to your boiler. And then the next step is to prepare for this feasibility study procurement. So some things to keep, the goal here is really to make sure that the end installation plan that you get is as similar as possible to what you're getting out of your feasibility study. Because of the procurement vehicles that we're using for installation, we really don't have a lot of opportunities to change things at that end, so we want to put a lot of thought into the feasibility study procurement. The other reason to do that is because we have a relatively small market right now, so there aren't a ton of vendors out there doing this. It's likely that you'll be speaking to the same vendor for both of these procurements, and if you're not using the same vendor for both procurements, they're probably going to be bidding on your second procurement, so you won't have an opportunity really to talk to that vendor in between procurements either. So just thinking about that before the feasibility study is important. For the feasibility study, you want to include that the vendor will apply for the Mass DEC rebate for you, and that is up to $5,000. You want to make sure that you schedule in that some sort of review meeting with the vendor to hear back from them about barriers and risks, and you also want to make sure you're including that in the narrative. Something else that we found really helpful was to require 1 week of water metering on site. So this is some of what to expect from the feasibility study itself. We want to set aside a few hours on site at each building to do this walkthrough, install the water metering, and some time as well to uninstall that water metering at those water meters at the end of the week. You want to make sure that you're getting an analysis and energy model, an economic model, and again, for your vendor to apply for that rebate. So a lesson that we learned from this process is that it's important to make clear spaces for the vendor to identify any risks and barriers for the project so that you can make sure you're identifying those in the installation procurement and preparing the rest of the stakeholders in your community for these as well. So we thought it would be important to set up a review meeting in person with the vendor, and also to include facilities managers in those conversations. And something else that was a takeaway for us was that the structural review that you get out of the feasibility study for this price isn't a final structural review, so you need to keep in mind that you're going to have to do another structural review at the end as part of the installation. So that was one space where we saw this come up. The other thing is to be really clear about what documentation you want to get out of this, because the sooner you get all of your plans in a really clear way, even if those plans change later, you have something that you can clearly communicate with what this project would look like. So this is a roof plan, a pretty simple roof plan, just to give you an idea of what types of things you would want to get measurements of in this plan. You want to show the location of the collectors, the roof orientation and the pitch, what wind zone it's expected to be installed in, where the rail system would be installed. You want to get an idea of where the plumbing would come down from the roof, and just the dimensions and spacing of all the equipment. This could also look like a 3D model, and this could be a helpful way to show visually where these collectors would be in the final installation. And then the other important document that you want to get is the system diagram. So we required in ours that we got that we're only looking at drain back systems, and telling the difference between these 3 different types of systems can be really difficult if you don't have a system diagram that shows all the equipment clearly. So here is an example from the NAVCEP Installer Resource Guide for solar thermal installers, and this shows the basic equipment that goes into each system. And then your last stage is preparing for the installation procurement. So for this, you really want to make sure that everything meets the specifications of what you've identified in the feasibility study. You also want to make sure that your installation procurement is as easy as possible and as clear as possible for vendors to bid for, because the vendors that are in this space don't have a lot of resources to necessarily dedicate towards paperwork. They want to just make it, so our goal here was to make simple forms that would be not a huge lift for them to apply to, so that they could focus on really making these designs as best as they could. And then 4 things that we really wanted to focus on having the installation vendor identify are the type of collector and type of system that they're planning to use, the total annual field yield, the SRCC rating, and the storage size and equipment location that they plan to use. So this is a diagram of what the Chelsea Police Department roof looked like, and a big question that we had was where to attach the railing. So this is a pretty unique roof. It gave us a good example in this pilot of how important it is to have a roof plan and to really clearly show where equipment is going to go, because this is such a different roof than most roofs that we would be looking at. And this is another picture from the inside showing how these supports come together and how difficult it is to find a place for the attachments for the rails in this space in particular. So you want to plan for the worst case so that it can be smooth sailing. Something that was really important that we included was a price form, So we weren't looking for the total cost from each vendor, but rather we had a curated form that would get them to the net cost after incentives. We wanted to do this so that we were comparing apples to apples between different vendors. We also wanted to make sure that we were being really clear about how we were calculating different incentives. And so part of this was a solar thermal incentive calculator that we included. So we created a calculator that the vendors would put in a couple of the different values for each system that they were proposing for the two systems, and on one page of an Excel spreadsheet, and the other two tabs show how those different incentives are calculated. So because the incentive structure was a little bit variable as we were approaching this project, and some of them were quite new, we also wanted to show the vendors how we were calculating it so that they could use that for other projects as well. So here there's only a few inputs that they're actually putting into this calculator: the number of collectors and the service orientation factor, which we had already been able to calculate for the individual sites. So then there are two incentives that are important to just know about for this process. One is the Mass UC rebate. We already talked about the feasibility study rebate. The other rebate is for installation. And so this calculation is specifically for nonprofit entities. So this has changed recently to this new calculation that you're seeing. So now there's an average of 2 SRCC ratings, and this balance, so it's an average of the C and D rating, and the SRCC rating it can be for the individual collectors or for the entire system. This is for the individual collectors, and it's standardized, so you can look up what this rating is if you have the collector from the vendor. And then the other incentive to know about is the alternative energy credits, or AIC. DRR has a calculator where you can put in the system specifications and get an estimate of what your incentive would be from the AICs. They work similar to SRECs in that you're going to need to get an aggregator and sell these credits on the market, but you can estimate what this incentive would be by picking a price that you would think that the AIC would go for. We wanted to be conservative because there's a range from $15 to $25. We picked 18. It's probably good to be even more conservative than that, just to get your initial estimates. And for smaller systems, you can receive the 10-year total value in advance, which is really nice. And there's a different calculation for, there are two calculations for this, depending on which SRCC rating you want to use and the amount of time that you want to calculate it for. So we've put one into our calculator to make it consistent with the inputs that we're using for the Mass UC rebate, but you can calculate it both ways. Okay. So that's what the process looks like. We want to see if we have any questions.
Nicole, I think you were so efficient that you actually answered some of the questions that came in while the webinar was going. That was great. I did want to mention, this is Cami Peterson, also with the Clean Energy Department here at MAPC. I did want to mention one other funding source that's just good to be thinking about as you consider whether you're able to undertake the deployment of solar thermal systems on your municipal buildings, that the Department of Energy resources, their META grants, the Municipal Energy Technical Assistance grants, Can also pay for engineering studies and bid specs for solar thermal projects up to $12,500. So if that's something that you feel would be necessary or really preferred for your site, that's something that, those Meta grant opportunities come up usually once or twice a year, and so you might have the occasion to apply for that funding as well. So just another funding piece in that puzzle. Yeah, if there's any other questions, I don't see any right now. I think Patrick might have something to throw in while we wait for some more queries.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Would you mind popping back to the price form sheet?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to highlight something on this. So the gross cost that we get, that is going to be the cost that the towns contract for. So in terms of thinking about your budget, it is the gross cost that is paid, and then you will recoup the AICS and the Mass CEC incentive. And in this case, we chose to make the award based on the net cost. So the award was based on the net cost, but the contract that you would sign would need to be based on the gross cost. So that's important for budgeting. And I think also one of the important reasons for including the AICS and the Mass CEC incentive in creating a net cost that is the basis for your award is that there are some design decisions that the respondents can make even with your specs, within those specs. So as Nicole was saying earlier, requiring that everybody hits the minimum total annual field yield, requiring that they have at least a certain amount of storage, and that they use the technology type for the panels, and also like whether the system is a drain back or not. Like those are critical that everyone has to hit. Within that, there's definitely some things that can be up to their discretion, like where do the chases run, or exactly what data logger do they use, or things like that. So it isn't okay to allow some flexibility, but we felt that just to make sure no one's choice resulted in drastically different incentives, we would make them put those incentives in here, so that could be part of the award price.
We currently still don't have any additional questions, so I do encourage you to type some in now if you think of any, or to follow up with us at another point. I think we have a few more things that we'll kind of throw out to you guys in the next few minutes, and then if you do have any further questions, we'll continue with those then. I did want to mention, and we'll have another slide with some contact information, the project team that we worked with, Nicole mentioned at the start. We were really thankful to work with a great project team. This program was under Mass CEC Solar Thermal Challenge. It's been great working with that team there. Meister Consultants is our project partner in working with Mass CEC, and as part of the contract is the lead contractor with Mass CEC for that project, and we've been able to do this municipal procurement pilot as part of their larger project. So that's been a very good experience and has added to our technical expertise. There are also good resources on all things solar thermal. In terms of resources, we will be taking a lot of the materials you saw today. This slide presentation will be available, both the slides themselves and the recording, but we'll also have resources and templates on our website in the near future. So those will be, you can navigate to those from the MAPC Clean Energy site, where if you click on our solar thermal webpage from there, you'll be able to see the resources that we have available within the coming days or weeks. So more templates and resources to come, and we'll look forward to any questions too further from you guys, and I'll turn it over to Patrick before we wrap up.
Oh, thanks, Kim. Yeah, one other thing I just wanted to mention on the price form is that you'll see that there is a line for maintenance on there. We wanted to get maintenance pricing for 5 years for each community, so also just something that I think to make sure you include so that you have that option to exercise it if you'd like.
All right. Well, it doesn't seem like anyone else has any questions for us right now. So, Nicole, do you want to do any final wrap-up?
I think I'm just going to switch to the contact page. So if you have any more questions after today, you feel free to reach out to me at MAPC or to Jeremy Koo at Meister. We've been working really closely on this project. We're really excited to see it to its installation procurement step, and we're hoping to see some more projects in the future. So if you're just curious about this or any of the pieces of this, please reach out.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.